Hi, I'm Jesse.
And I'm Flo.
And welcome to an exciting new episode of Beyond the Great War, the segment where we answer your questions about what happened 100 years ago.
Hi Jesse.
Hi Flo.
Are you wondering why I'm here?
Just a bit.
Okay, I'm here to tell you and all the viewers out there in YouTube land about, well, this new format that you just introduced, which is called Beyond the Great War. So what is Beyond the Great War? It's an evolution of what we used to do in our format called Out of the Trenches. It's the episode that we release where we answer the questions from the community. But instead of just, having 2 or 3 questions from the community and then answering them very, very briefly, we're now going to take much more time to answer them in greater detail. Why are we doing this? Well, first of all, I think some of the questions for the 1919 period need some more detail. And on the other hand, it also means that we probably directly or indirectly answer more questions from more people about the same topic. And why is it called Beyond the Great War? Because it's not just for questions about, the actual events or people or whatever. It's also the format where we will take time for historical debates. So what is an historical debate? As an example, I prepared the first question for this format. And that question is, what is the brutalization theory? I recently went out with a historian, we had a few beers, and he told me about that. And I was like, okay, so what is this theory? And why is such a theory a good tool for historians? Like, how can they use that to answer whatever question? So I'm just going to go behind the camera, do my production magic, and I will leave the answer to that question to you.
All right. Thanks, Flo.
Bye, Jesse.
Well, like any historical theory, the brutalization thesis is a way of trying to answer a question. And in this case, the question is, why was Europe so violent in the first half of the 20th century? I mean, the Great War was awful and resulted in millions of people being killed. So why then did the fighting continue after the war? Why would people turn to violent ideologies like fascism, Nazism, or Stalinism? And how could World War II and the Holocaust happen even though society had already experienced the horrors of a total war? Now, although the armistice had been signed, Europe was still a violent place after the war was over, as we've already seen in the last episode about the January uprising in Germany and the civil wars and revolutions across Europe. Now, the violence got even worse in World War II, when even more people were killed and genocides were scientifically planned and carried out. So the brutalization theory is a way to try to explain how violence could continue and even get worse in spite of the horrors of the Great War. Now, George Moss laid out the best-known argument for the brutalization theory. Now, his work concentrated on Germany, but he also discussed other countries as well. And he basically wrote that the societies which had experienced violence during the Great War became brutalized as a result. And the soldiers who were traumatized during the war carried it home with them. And they effectively transferred wartime violence to the home front, where it then became part of the post-war culture. And there had been so much death during the war that people became, to some extent, indifferent to it. Central to this brutalized culture was the creation and glorification of a so-called myth of the war experience. Now, this myth turned the horror of war into an object of almost religious reverence. The fallen, which is a poetic way of saying the dead, were heroes whose memory was to inspire the nation to a greatness that had not been achieved during the war. Now, this myth incorporated nationalism, religion, and ideas about manliness into a powerful mix. It also rested on national revenge and ideas of Christian resurrection and suffering. The true future of the nation was a man, and a man was someone who was ready to kill or be killed. And this process of brutalization influenced culture and politics. The language of the front was used in political speech, and paramilitary violence in the name of politics became quite common. And just as the military enemy had to be defeated in the war, now the political enemy had to be wiped out. The idea of a political struggle had merged with real-life ideas about violence. And this allowed society to accept violent ideologies, actual violence, and eventually mass death on an unprecedented scale in World War II and the Holocaust. A new normal had been created following the collective trauma of the Great War. And that's only one of the many reasons why in German, the Great War is often called the Urkatastrophe of the 20th century. And roughly translated, that means it was the original catastrophe from which all others flowed. Of course, not all historians subscribe to the brutalization theory. Some have argued that while it does have a strong point, it can't fully explain the post-1918 violence. For example, there was no large-scale violence in France or Great Britain or Belgium after the war, even though millions of men and women from those countries had suffered and inflicted suffering during the war, in the same way as those from countries where violence actually did break out. In theory, French and British and Belgians would be as brutalized and as likely to turn to fascism as the societies that actually did, like Germany or parts of the former Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. And the questions that these historians ask are a little bit different. They want to know why large-scale violence and a turn to extremism happened in some places, but not in others. It seems the original brutalization thesis doesn't really have a compelling answer to this question. Now, in a way of trying to find an answer, some researchers have questioned the level of violence actually perpetrated by individual soldiers during the war. Now, many of them, of course, did see fellow soldiers being killed and wounded, but how many of them and how often actually attempted to deliberately kill an enemy that they could see? Some studies suggest it was a lot fewer than one might suspect, with no more than 25% of combat veterans actually having shot at an enemy on the Western Front at least. Most of the killing was not done face to face. It was the result of artillery bombardments which were fired off from far behind the lines. And occasions for personalized killing and the resulting brutalization, they just weren't that common because going over the top and charging into the enemy position didn't happen all that frequently for individual soldiers. Even when they did attack, soldiers often tried to avoid killing or, when they did, bitterly regretted it afterwards. In the words of Antoine Prost, brutalization, defined as the lifting of the prohibition on killing and the liberation of murderous instincts, could only have affected a small minority. This critique makes it more difficult to explain how brutalization took place, when relatively few soldiers had actually behaved brutally. So that kind of leads us to the question of what other answer could there be to the question of post-1918 violence and extremism? Robert Gerwarth offers one alternative explanation, though he limits it to the immediate post-war years. And it kind of goes like this. First off, the actual violence and the cult glorifying it didn't flourish in the countries that won the war. Well, with the exception of Italy, but that's a whole other story that maybe we'll get to someday. The revolutions and civil wars took place in the defeated powers. So the destabilizing and radicalizing effect of defeat must be a part of the post-war violence equation. Now, secondly, the Russian Revolution had a dramatic and polarizing effect on people from all across Europe. Some were inspired to strive for violent revolution based on the Bolshevik example. But many others were so afraid of the revolution spreading to their country that they were willing to use deadly force to stop it, whether or not the threat was as serious as they feared. Finally, violence happened where states collapsed, and didn't happen where the states survived. You see, normally the state has a monopoly on violence, so only the police and the army can legitimately use violence to keep order or carry out state policy like waging a war. Now, when Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, there was a power vacuum. The new states that replaced them were not only weak, but they also couldn't agree on their own borders either. So this led to internal violence to define the form of these new states, but also to small wars between them to settle their border disputes. And Winston Churchill called these wars of the pygmies, which wasn't particularly nice of him. Now, in the end, I would say that the combined effect of defeat, the Russian Revolution, and state collapse is also an answer worth considering, especially for the immediate post-war years. And generally speaking, in my view, whatever its strengths and weaknesses, the brutalization thesis is certainly an interesting way of trying to account for the fact that no simple armistice or peace treaty could end the cycle of violence unleashed by the Great War. And as usual in history, the answer we get depends on what questions we ask about the past. So now it's time for you to tell us what you think in the comments. And here's another question we got from our community. Didn't the Paris Peace Conference also start in January 19? You didn't talk about that in your first episode. So how did it actually start, and could you tell us more about the setup of the conference? Well, the November 11th armistice may have put an end to the war, though certainly not to the fighting, as we've seen, but the settling of an actual peace was another challenge entirely. On January 18th, delegates from more than 30 states gathered in Paris to begin the peace conference. It was the most significant undertaking of this kind since the Congress of Vienna after the end of the Napoleonic Wars over 100 years earlier. And by the way, the starting date was no accident. On that same day, January 18th, in 1871, the German Empire had been founded in Versailles, following the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War. But the conference was also different than any which came before it. The war that was to be officially ended had been bloodier, more expensive, and more destructive than any in history. Not only would the delegates need to find a way to bring the war to a close with peace treaties, but they also wanted to establish a new order for Europe and for the world to prevent such a war from breaking out again. It was a massive affair, the top news story of the day. 500 journalists came to Paris to report on the proceedings, though they were soon to be disappointed by how little information was actually made public. Now, apart from the heads of state, the diplomats and their staffs, hundreds of experts in various fields participated in the conference as well. They worked in 52 commissions and dozens more subcommissions, which would eventually meet more than 1,600 times to attempt to resolve a host of questions. Now, their job was to provide advice to those who were making the decisions. There were lawyers for questions of war guilt, economists and statisticians for war reparations, and there were also historians and geographers for questions of national borders and ethnic minorities. Now, one expert who participated was the famous British economist John Maynard Keynes, who would go on to become a sharp critic of the resulting peace treaties. Now, despite the presence of so many delegates, the main decisions would be made by the Council of 10. That is to say, 2 representatives each for the Allied powers of Britain, France, Italy, the United States, and also Japan. Soon, though, the so-called Big Four, and that's just Britain, the US, France, and Italy, took control of the conference, and it was really their leaders who determined the outcomes. Now, it wasn't going to be easy for the conference of 1919 to achieve its goals of ending the war and creating a new world order. I mean, for a start, the conference opened without any prior agreement as to how to proceed, leading one French observer to predict that the result would be, quote, an improvisation, unquote. Now, many members of the various commissions assumed that the Germans would be consulted eventually, and prepared harsh terms as a starting point for the negotiations. In fact, one British delegate later wrote, "Had it been known from the outset that no negotiations would ever take place with the enemy, it is certain that many of the less reasonable clauses of the treaty would never have been inserted." And the victorious countries also had diverging views. Their aims were a contradictory mix of traditional notions of territory and power, but were also economic, ideological, and to some extent utopian as well. France wanted above all to eliminate any future threat of German aggression. And they also wanted the return of the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, plus reparations to help pay for the destruction of the war zone. The British hoped to keep a balance of power in Europe, and they also wanted to extend their colonial empire in the Middle East and ensure that Germany would never again become a commercial or colonial rival as it had before 1914. Italy, for its part, coveted more territory to its north and east, including Istria, Trieste, the Dalmatian coast, and the city of Fiume. Now, the United States, which had suffered much less than its allies during the war, focused more on the establishment of the League of Nations, which was meant to be an international organization which would work to prevent future wars from breaking out and guarantee world peace. Now, all the participants had to, so to speak, dress up their desires in the clothing of the 14 points proposed by Wilson, the President of the US, the year before. But they didn't see eye to eye on these points either. The points relating to secret diplomacy, free trade, disarmament, self-determination, new borders, Russia, and European colonies had the potential to cause disagreement, and they would as the conference went on. Now, many of the war aims were incompatible with the 14 points, and this was especially true with respect to the case of national determination, like the plan to give Poland access to the sea by assigning it majority German-speaking territories around the city of Danzig, or the inherent contradiction of maintaining colonial empires. The differences were so acute that French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau said with regards to Wilson's program, "If I accepted such a thing after so many millions have been killed or suffered, I expect and hope that my successor would take me by the scruff of the neck and have me shot." Now, there were many other constraints on the Big Four as well. Each had to balance domestic politics while the conference was going on. Now, for example, Wilson's position at the conference was made a lot more complicated by the fact that he, a Democrat, had just lost majority support in both houses of Congress, and many Republicans felt the US should just not be involved in cleaning up Europe's mess. Now, there were the millions of dead as well to bear in mind, and the emotional trauma of relatives and survivors. There were prior political commitments, such as the Treaty of London, which had promised large chunks of territory to Italy in 1915. And there were also the emotional hangovers of the war. Now, the public was still in a war mindset after 4 years of propaganda, which caused Keynes to bemoan the blind anti-German passion which still motivated many on the Allied side. Now, the French Foreign Minister, Stéphane Pichon, wasn't hiding his feelings when he said, "On our territory, at Versailles, at the gates of our capital, Germany has given up its claim for world domination, a claim which was built upon the destruction of the freedom of nations." Also, events in some parts of Europe and the Middle East were happening at a blinding pace and changing the facts on the ground as the peace conference was still going on. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire had broken up, and Germany was rocked by revolution more than once. And no one knew what to do about Russia, where a civil war was raging in which many of the powers at the peace conference were actually fighting, and no one was sure how it would end. The peace conference also faced a further difficulty which was not fully appreciated at the time, for the statesmen and experts gathered there represented only the victorious powers. Neither the defeated Central Powers nor Bolshevik Russia were granted a seat at the negotiating table. So whatever could be achieved, the losers would pay the price, which could only be justified if they were forced to accept responsibility for starting the war. Now, this was a complete break from normal peace negotiations of the past, and this would have grave consequences in the future. Now, despite all of these limitations, enormous expectations were placed on the outcome of the conference, and the leaders were conscious of the weight of history on their shoulders. Woodrow Wilson, even before he reached Paris, wrote that he feared that no matter what happened, it might end in a tragedy of disappointment. As the conference opened, it remained to be seen whether idealism or good old-fashioned realpolitik would determine the outcome of the peace, and the stakes had never been higher. Now, we will of course cover the peace conference in the upcoming months and see how it continues to develop. This was our first exciting episode of Beyond the Great War. If you have any questions about events or historical figures, tactics, or historical debates, just post them in the comments below. And if you really want your question to get through to us, you can consider supporting us on Patreon. We're also going to answer community questions in the Great War Patreon podcast, for example. And as always, you can find the sources that we use for this episode in the video description. You can also get in touch with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. I'm Jesse Alexander. This is The Great War, a production of Real-Time History and the only YouTube history channel that has proper catering for its peace conferences.
And now a message from the future.
Hey.
We just want to say
Thank you for 1 million subscribers.
It has been almost 5 years now since we started the project. It has been an incredible ride. Thank you for everybody who subscribed. Thank you for everybody who told their friends and their relatives about this show. Thank you for all the support, for the people who came to the fan meetings, and thank you for making the best job of our life so far, I guess.
Yeah, that, and also making it a very pleasant experience to transition the show to a new concept, for the warm welcome that Jesse got, and yeah, stay tuned for more exciting episodes, and woohoo!
Hey! Woo!